Hello, listener. Welcome to the podcast show titled The African Data Scientist, where we get to tell the story of the African data science and AI potential. My name is Stephen Oladele, and I'll be your host for this episode. And in this episode of the show, you're going to be learning a lot of things on a federal researcher's journey from the United States, who spent most of his time in the academia, of course. You're going to be learning about geospatial data analysis for developing countries in Africa, the evolution of the GIS system from an expert's perspective who has been working with it for decades, and how Africa can emerge with her own revolutionary technology independent of the West, amongst other things, life journey, career journey, and so on. This guest is Dr. Lee Dikola, a retired federal researcher of the United States of America, former lecturer of applied statistics at the University of Ibadan, Oyo State, Nigeria, and a former professor of geography at the University of Vermont, US, and of course a part-time course instructor on geographic information systems, data visualization and data science, spatial data analysis at the University of Baltimore currently. We hope you enjoy the show, and as usual, you can listen to the show at 1.5 times the original speed. We'd love to speed through the episode. Else, let's dive right in. Hello, Dr. Lee. Welcome to our show once again on the episode, The African Data Scientist. How are you feeling today?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm very fine. Thank you. Thanks for honoring our invitation and coming to our show once again. We appreciate your sharing your knowledge and, of course, giving your time for our local community and for our listeners as well. Just starting out with you, can you tell us a bit about yourself? Just introducing yourself this much.
Yes, well, I guess I can start with the present and move backward. I'm a retired U.S. Geological Survey researcher. At least was my last full-time job. I also occasionally teach geographic information systems and statistical analysis at a local university, a branch of the University of Maryland here in the area around Washington, D.C. I live in Reston, Virginia, which is a community that was established in the 1960s. It was built as a new town from scratch. I've lived here for 30 years. I retired from the U.S. Geological Survey in 2010. So moving backwards, before that, I was a professor of geography at various colleges, including the University of Vermont. And before that, I was a professor of a lecturer in political science at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. I was there from about 1978 until 1984. And even though I was teaching political science, I always had an interest in spatial analysis and geography. And because the UI geography department was such a good, high-ranking institution, I decided I would do a PhD in geography while I was in Ibadan. And this was at the time, you may remember, in the late 70s when Nigeria was moving its capital from Lagos to Abuja. So the focus of my research was how much difference does it make for a city in a country to be the capital city. So that led to a PhD dissertation, which was awarded in 1984. And before that, I was teaching part-time in various parts of the country, of the United States, including Boston. And I was a student at Berkeley. And I was born in Hollywood, California in 1944, which seems like, and indeed is, a long time ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
My life in reverse.
Well, thanks, Dr. Lee. Absolutely. This seems like a long career, really. Starting out in, of course, 1944. Yeah, that's a long time. And thanks so much for having to share that journey with us. So what was your time in Nigeria like during your PhD studies?
Well, I went to Nigeria in 1978, partly with my eyes wide closed, as to use a title from a movie by Stanley Kubrick. I really didn't know what I was getting into. The reason I was interested in going to Africa was twofold. One was that my father was born in Cape Town in 1906. I've never been to South Africa, although I hope to visit there this year or maybe next year. And so Africa was always part of my consciousness, at least at some level. Although to my father, obviously Nigeria was a pretty exotic place. He had been to South Africa. He'd born in South Africa, grew up in Namibia, and then in Europe, and then moved to the United States just before I was born. So I was interested in going to Nigeria partly because of my a connection to Africa, and partly because of music. Actually, I'm an amateur musician, and I had always been fascinated by African music and the rhythms of Africa. So, but I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. I applied to jobs all over the continent. I speak a little French, so I applied to jobs at some francophone universities, and the University of Ibadan accepted me. And frankly, when I got the telegram from the university, I had to look it up on a net atlas to see where it was. And I mean, I know that sounds strange, but even today, as you can well imagine, there are Americans who don't know much about Africa. People who asked me when I went there if I was going to drive. I mean, how can you imagine how ignorant people could be? But when I arrived in Nigeria, I guess I hadn't known that Nigeria was at that time in the middle of an oil boom. And one of the reasons I think I was hired was that they could afford to hire expatriates and give them pretty decent salaries back in the late 70s. So I was given the job of teaching political science mainly because they wanted someone to teach social statistics in the social science faculty. So I was asked to put together a course that would introduce statistics to students from political science, geography, anthropology, economics, and psychology. So it was a big challenge to try to integrate statistics in such a way that it would appeal to students from all of those different disciplines. And I think that was a very enriching experience for me because I was able to think in a very broad sense about data science, which at that time, data science was mainly statistics. I mean, when people talked about data, they talked about statistics, and statistics has always been a somewhat frightening subject for people. So I attempted to make the subject very visual, and I even wrote a little textbook which I printed at my own expense and then sold to the students. So that was a very satisfying experience to put together that course, and I taught it for several years. So that was and then my wife joined me. We had been separated for several years. My wife joined me in about 1979, and then we had a daughter in Nigeria. Yes, she came. Okay. She was a librarian. She has a degree in library science, so she worked at the University Hospital Library, UCH Library. And then 9 months, almost to the day after she joined me, we were joined by Bamidele, or at least the little girl we called Bamidele at the time. Her name is actually Melanie DeCola. She's now 39, and she was the one I spent the camping adventure with last week. So she was born there. And then in 1984, I had finished the PhD dissertation, and my father had been ill with cancer. He died, and I decided to return to the United States, where I took a bunch of part-time jobs. So that's another. So my experience in Nigeria was extremely rewarding, very satisfying. I mean, the dissertation, the publications, the friends I made, the places I visited, I liked the people. And sometimes I think if things hadn't been getting more difficult in Nigeria at the time, I might well have stayed. I have one or two friends who are still there, and I have contacts with my dissertation professor, Bola Ayeni, who is who's still working and doing research in the region. So I have almost entirely positive memories of Nigeria.
So that's awesome. Thanks a lot, Dr. Lee, for such insights. I mean, can definitely see that you spent quite some time in Nigeria, and of course, owing to the fact that you also spent your time teaching at the University of Ibadan, of course, in Oyo State, Nigeria now. And so, what were the things you noticed that were wrong, or the things you think would have had some effect on the country's growth during your time there? You looked at Nigeria and you saw, oh yeah, things were getting pretty difficult, and you think there were things that were meant to be done this way and not this way. Or what were those like?
Well, of course, it's trite but true that Nigeria suffered from what is, I think, called the resource curse. That it when I arrived there, I mean, one of the reasons, I mean, if you go back just before my arrival in Nigeria, I was a student at MIT. I was a PhD student at MIT, and I really wasn't I'm a kind of a restless person, so I really wasn't that engaged in the research I was being asked to do, and so I opened up a bicycle shop. I'd always been interested in bicycles, and the MIT didn't have a bike store in the neighborhood, so I collaborated with a fellow student, and we opened up the shop down the street from MIT, and it did very well. But again, I became restless, and I decided I wanted to move on. And the reason I'm raising that point is that the reason I started the bike shop was that the United States was experiencing the other side of Nigeria's oil boom. The U.S. was experiencing an oil crisis in which OPEC had restricted the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC had restricted its exports of oil, and oil prices shot up, and there were oil lines. And so I was convinced that bicycles were the answer to this problem, and that's why we opened up the bike shop. But when I got to Nigeria, I looked at the other side of this oil crisis, and I realized that Nigeria was experiencing. To me, it was an exciting and enjoyable experience to be in a country that was going through a phase of a boom. You could buy cars cheaply. You could have fine housing. You got holiday allowances to travel back to the United States and so on and so forth. But that all ended, and rather quickly. I mean, when you consider that during the time I was there, 5-6 years, I mean, things went from boom to bust. And I've obviously thought a lot about that whole issue, and looking over the questions you kindly sent me, I thought one answer for Africa is somehow to leapfrog over some of the unsustainable technologies that have plagued the West, and most particularly fossil fuels. And so, one of the things that I think Africa needs to do is to think about alternative forms of energy, such as solar and wind and maybe wave and tide, even though that's pretty exotic, but certainly solar power and wind power, and obviously hydropower and so forth. So that would be one lesson that I think one could learn from the Western experience. But the other more deeper question is the whole idea of making a transition to a consumer culture. And if a nation becomes wedded to and addicted to not only fossil fuels, but technologies that are unsustainable, or computers, or automobiles, or artificial materials, or plastic. I mean, plastic is a global crisis, and the advantage that African countries may have is that they can look at the fallacious philosophy that has driven Western development and say, perhaps we can avoid some of that dead end technology, and take our own route to prosperity through less and by less, I mean less. I mean just consuming less of everything, having less of everything, reusing things, and finding sources of energy and of inspiration that are renewable. And I think that's the African challenge, and I think the African advantage is that they can turn their backs to some extent on what the West has done and seek a new way.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for such insights. And it's my hope that listeners who are in the position of power in African countries listening to this podcast can take the necessary best practices and steps you've mentioned, which are quite insightful and useful here. Thank you so much for that. So, Dr. Lee, you are now retired and perhaps spending more time with your family. Looking back at your career, how did that start out for you? Did you have it in mind specifically to be a research physical scientist, or what was that journey like?
My career has been very. It's not quite a random walk, but it's certainly been kind of fractal. It's if you look at the typical academic scientist in the United States and in the world at large would be someone, a woman or a man, who is smart and does well in school and graduates from high school and then goes to university and gets, let's just say, let's talk about economics. So you get a bachelor's degree in economics, and then you do a master's degree in economics, and then you do a PhD in economics, and then you get a assistant professorship at a university in economics, and you rise up the ranks to become an associate professor and a full professor. And during that time, you publish hundreds of articles and maybe a few books, and you interviewed on television and so on and so forth. And that's a pretty straightforward career. My particular life story is not at all like that. There are certain constancies. I've always had an interest in mathematics. I was a math major as an undergraduate, and I've always had an interest in music. But I've never. I mean, aside from the occasional gig performing at a care home, I've never made any money from my music. But so what are the themes in my career? Particularly the idea of visualization. I think it's really important to emphasize the visual qualities of scientific research. So whenever I'm doing a project, for example, one of our colleagues from Senegal just sent me some data as a result of the workshop we were doing, and he didn't tell me anything about what the data were, but he just sent me a spreadsheet, a text file, and I read the text file into R. And the first thing I did was make a picture. What does the data look like? What kind of patterns do you see? And I have a whole lecture I give on data visualization, on the dimensions of data and the principles of data visualization. So, and that leads me to two other themes in my work. One is in the United States, there's a big kind of revolution surrounding the idea of STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And that's been enlarged now to become STEAM, where they add the letter A, which references art. But I think it should be STEAMM. I think music is also a part of learning. I think music is a very mathematical language, and I would if I had my life to live over again, I would love to develop a mathematical musical teaching system whereby kids could learn how to use music to understand mathematical patterns, powers of two, and factorization, and frequencies, and overtones, and all of the rich kinds of mathematical concepts that come out of music. again, I mean, visualization and what's now called sonification, reaching out and thinking out of the box is something that I've always enjoyed. I've always enjoyed doing, tying things together that aren't necessarily obviously linked together. That's been one of the themes of my life.
Thanks, Dr. Lee, for such insights in your career. And, you've had such an amazing career, because numerous back and forth between the STEM field as well as, like you said, visualization. And you also mentioned you had specific interest in spatial analysis. Now, of course, I reckon spatial analysis is a field that I really reckon our listeners may be new to. Can you let us know what spatial analysis is in very accessible terms, lay terms, and something people can understand?
Well, it's an interesting challenge, Stephen, because here we are talking. This is an audio recording, and so I don't have any visual aids to come to my assistance, but so much the better. I typically, when I lecture on or teach about data science, I talk about the three dimensions of data: who, what, where, and when. Now, you invited me to teach a workshop on when. We were looking at spatial analysis. We were looking at temporal analysis, and when I teach spatial analysis, I look at the where. So, spatial analysis is the problem of looking at what is happening at a given place in space, and by space I mean either one dimension along a line, or two dimensions along a plane, or even in three dimensions along in a volume. And one of the great things about spatial analysis these days is that it's being facilitated by open source software. Yeah. When I was working for the U.S. Geological Survey, we were developing, the USGS was really in the forefront of geographic information science. We were developing computer techniques and data structures and algorithms for making maps, because the U.S. Geological Survey has been at the forefront of map making for over 150 years. It has produced and still produces some of the key map series for the development of the United States. So in order to do that and to continue to do it in the most advanced way, the USGS developed geographic information systems technologies to do that. But what happened was that the private sector came along, as it always does, and developed even more advanced systems for doing spatial analysis. So if you look back on the history of GIS during the 60s and 70s, geographers were making maps, but they had very crude technology for doing that. And then in the 80s, 90s, along came computers, which resulted in a revolution in spatial analysis. And then in the 90s and aughts and teens, the private sector came along and developed, partly in response to the leadership of, say, the USGS and the Ordnance Survey and many other federal agencies. The private sector came along and developed even more advanced and exciting tools for doing spatial analysis. But what's happening today, right, lately in the last 10 years or so, is that there's a plethora of open source tools such as Quantum GIS, QGIS, and R, and OpenStreetMap for doing GIS. And so anybody with a computer, as long as you have a computer and a reasonably fast internet connection, you can download the software and download the tutorials for these tools and learn how to do GIS. So I would say that's the current revolution, is that you can now do spatial analysis. And the best way to learn spatial analysis is not to listen to a lecture or look at a video so much as just do it yourself. Try download some data, do a tutorial, and within a few weeks you'll be able to understand a good deal of what spatial analysis is about.
All right. Thank you so much for that insight once again, Dr. Lee. Dr. Lee, it's been a few decades now since your role at the U.S. Geological Survey Department as a research physical scientist. What was your career like as a research physical scientist? Did you work with, say, folks from NASA, or how was that collaboration like at the federal science level?
Well, I was at the USGS for 20 years, and I came into the USGS with an interest in a topic, a fairly sophisticated mathematical topic called fractals, or fractal analysis. I don't know, do you know the term?
Not really.
Okay. Well, it's worth looking into. It was conceived by a Swiss-American mathematician by the name of Benoit Mandelbrot. He conceived of the idea of a new field of geometry that would deal with fractional dimensions. So in spatial analysis, we think of a point as having 0 dimensions, and a line as having 1 dimension, and a plane as having 2 dimensions, and a volume as having 3 dimensions. And Mandelbrot's insight was to say, well, the world doesn't work that way. Everything has fractional dimensions. So he took the word fractional dimension and turned it into fractal. And I started doing that research when I was in Nigeria, because I was interested in spatial phenomena that weren't just points and lines and polygons and areas, but were complicated. So I started doing that, and then a few years later, we became interested in that enabled me to look at the growth of cities in the United States, and we took the U.S. Geological Survey map data and transferred it into animations in which we looked at the growth of cities over the course of time. And so I did a lot of work on what we called urban dynamics. And then, I don't want to belabor this topic. I'll skip a couple of topics. Yeah. In about a relevant subject to today is that in about 2000 or 1999, the United States, particularly the northeastern United States, was experiencing an epidemic of what's called West Nile virus. This was an emerging disease that happened to be carried by mosquitoes, but it was associated with crows, and horses would get it. So it was a very complicated disease. And ironically enough, our main epidemiological organization, namely the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, came to the USGS with requests for spatial analytical expertise. So even though they were very good at measuring things over time, looking at numbers of cases, numbers of deaths, they didn't have a great deal of expertise in looking at spatial analysis. So the CDC went to the USGS and said, okay, guys and gals, can you help us do better spatial analysis? So I spent several years developing tools, collaborating with other people, developing tools for mapping diseases, particularly emerging diseases. And I spent a lot of time also looking at Lyme disease, which is a tick-borne disease. Vector-borne diseases are very complicated to understand. COVID is not a vector-borne disease. It's not carried by a vector. It's carried in the air. It's transmitted person to person. But similarly, I'm also trying to map the spread of COVID-19. And so that we spent several years doing that kind of research, and then towards the end of my career at the USGS, I was looking at satellite images and how kind of went back to my original fractal analysis and used some spatial analysis to understand how land cover is changing. If you know better than I, perhaps, looking around Nigeria, how quickly the landscape transforms from rainforest to agriculture to urban or suburbanization or urbanization. So I became interested once again in how can you understand and perhaps control land cover using satellite images in spatial analysis. And then I retired in 2010 with the idea of doing more research and of teaching. I wasn't quite as active as I had expected to be. I guess I would say for those of you contemplating retirement, it's a good idea to ramp down. The federal government tends to just kick you out the door. On Friday you're working and on Monday you're not. And I think that can be a pretty sudden transition for people. So it's a good idea to kind of ramp down, maybe, go from 5 days a week to 3 days a week and finish up projects over the course of a few years and so forth. So that would be a kind of a lesson from my retirement experience at the USGS. But I still have friends at the USGS. I still go to lectures there. I go to lunch there. I still have connections with the USGS. Every summer I work on a science camp where I teach kids how to read maps and how to navigate using the sun. So I still have strong connections with the USGS.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dr. Lee, once again. So after your time at the USGS, of course, you spent some few decades as an instructor at various campuses and in higher institutions. And of course, you're now retired. What are the few life lessons you have learned from teaching and impacting people with knowledge throughout the time you spent as an instructor?
Well, other than the emphasis on broadness, I mean, being broad, not necessarily being too narrow in your focus. I mean, I think it's a good idea to be narrow and broad at the same time. To master a subject, for example, I think I became a world-class expert on fractals, which is a fairly narrow subject. On the one hand, it's a very complicated and sophisticated subset of geometry, which is a subset of mathematics, which is a subset of science. So on the one hand, I became very focused on that particular subject and mastered it and became friends with and collaborators with some of the leading scientists in that area. But on the other hand, I've continued to be very broad in my outlook. I'm interested in music and I'm interested in art. I've even, I like to sketch. I like to make visual representations. Another thing I guess I neglected to mention, I've always had an interest in water. And by that I mean I've always had an interest in the ocean. I keep a spreadsheet on my computer organized by year, and now I'm up to row number 70. I mean, my birthday is next week, so I'm at row number 76 or 75 in my spreadsheet. And one of the things I did when I was a young man at the age of 20 was I joined the Coast Guard, the United States Coast Guard. This was at a time when the U.S. was engaged in the Vietnam War, and I frankly didn't want to be drafted. I didn't want to be sent to Vietnam, so I joined the Coast Guard, which is a military branch, and I became interested in sailing. And I actually spent 6 weeks on a sailing ship, sailing from San Francisco on the West Coast to Connecticut on the East Coast. So ever since then, I've had a fascination with the ocean. I've always had an affection for and a deep respect for the ocean and for water. So I've done some sailing. A few last year, I went kayaking around Florida. The year before, I took a 2,000, or I guess, 2,000 kilometer sailing trip from the east coast of the United States down to the Caribbean. So I've always had an interest in the ocean. My wife and I took a cruise from New York to Chicago on a small boat up the Great Lakes of the United States. So I've always had a fascination with ocean. So I guess I would say to think of a geometric lesson I would draw from that would be to be broad and narrow at the same time. Make sure you really understand something well, but don't let that understanding blind you to the richness of the world and all of the things that there are out there to learn.
Well, I think that's a really good life lesson. I think our listeners will be able to take note of and take good insights from. Now, as somebody who served as a federal scientist, of course, at the USGS, how do you think African countries can improve sectors like their environmental, spatial analysis, and forecasting? Because I know for sure that we aren't really there yet. As African countries like Kenya, Nigeria, Rwanda, and other African countries, both north, south, and west of Africa, are not really there yet when it comes to having to utilize these sectors of environmental spatial analysis. How do you think we can improve it as African countries?
Well, again, I at the risk of repeating myself, I mean, one of the things when I was in Nigeria, my research enabled me to kind of backfill my education. Frankly, before I went to Nigeria, I had very little interest in what was then called developing countries or the third world. I was very interested in high technology, and I was interested in urbanization in the United States. But unlike many of my colleagues or my fellow students, I didn't have much of an interest in countries outside of the United States. And so when I got to Nigeria and started studying development, I forced myself to go back to the literature in development and in critical thinking, and to read people like Fanon and Marx and Arrighi and Lenin, just the whole rich literature of capitalism versus socialism and colonialism and post-colonialism and so forth. And I'm a quick read, so I was able to pick up a lot of insights into that, and I can't help but think that the so-called West is on an unsustainable journey, an unsustainable track. That it simply. My daughter, who's a clever woman in her own right, was saying, we were talking in the car, and she looked out the window at the rearview mirror, and she said, planetary limitations are closer than they appear. Now, if you look at the side wing of a car, frequently there's etched on the side of the wing it says, objects are closer than they appear. And that was a very clever. I don't know whether she invented that comment herself or not, but it's pretty clear that this pandemic is not an isolated event. It is a challenge to global development. It is telling people. It should be telling people in no uncertain terms that there are too many people. They are interacting too intensively with their environment, and they simply don't know how to take care of them of their house. If you look at the word ecology, the word and economics, they're both based on the Greek word for home, We're living on a small planet, and there are far, far too many people occupying that planet. But not only are there too many of us, those of us who are here are just exploiting resources in a thoughtless kind of a way. So when I think about Africa, I think the essence, the lesson to be drawn is how can Africans avoid making many of the mistakes that were made by the West. I mean, in terms of the epidemic, is there a way to manage the illness without destroying the economy? Is there a way of creating communities in which people are less exposed to environmental and epidemiological threats? Perhaps smaller scale communities that are less entangled in the global system, the global network of supply and demand. So, there's certainly no question. I mean, Africa may have its technological problems, and it may be in some respects technologically deficient, but it's certainly not deficient in terms of imagination, in terms of human thought. Some of the greatest literature, some of the greatest art, some of the greatest music has been produced, and even technology has come out of Africa. So I think, if as a young person in a young African, I would always be asking myself, how can I listen locally to the wisdom of the people around me, the people who have been living in this continent and whose roots are in the continent and not in some foreign and alien technology.
All right. Thank you so much for such insight once again, Dr. Lee. Now, looking back at we talk about the same progress in Africa, technological advancements, and trying to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes that the West made, of course, always making, in fact, because I'm looking at the problems we're facing with the planet Earth currently, and most likely, like your daughter, of course, rightfully claimed, the limitations coming forward. What would be your advice to, whether they are non-profits, corporations, governments, organizations, looking to bring in solutions that are centered around, spatial data analysis, trying to curb all these environmental problems, geographic information systems to solve some of our most challenging environmental problems in Africa? What would be your advice for these people?
Well, that's a challenging question. I guess I would wax philosophical by saying one of the myths that I hear, that I've always heard. Just let's focus on GIS, geographic information system. One of the things that you would hear, particularly when GIS was developing, was that GIS was a tool. And by that, people meant it's a tool that can be used for any purpose, good or evil. And I deny that. It's sure, it's easy to, a toothpick is a tool. You have a piece of meat stuck in between your teeth. You take the piece of wood and you dig into your gums and you get the piece of meat out, and you're finished with the toothpick, and you can either put it in your pocket or, if it's made of wood, you can toss it out the window and it's not going to do any harm. Simple, beginning, middle, and end. I have something in my tooth. I use the toothpick to pick it out. It's a tool. I'm finished with it. Geographic information systems, just to take that as an example, are extremely complicated systems. And if you go to the literature, I mean, I have great respect for Jack Dangermond, who's the founder and the CEO of Environmental Research Systems Institute, ESRI. If you search on the term ESRI, they are still the leading leading providers of GIS technology in the world. But Jack Dangerman will go on and on about how GIS is people, it's data, it's hardware, it's software. It's far, far more than a tool. It's the way a toothpick or a hammer or a screwdriver is.
Yeah.
A cup, a cup is a very simple tool. You can fill it with water. You can drink the water. You're finished with it. But GIS or computers or automobiles or spacecraft or audio tech, any sufficiently complicated technology cannot be regarded as a tool. It is an entity in itself that transforms the user. So I joke that human beings have evolved into a new species, which I call Homo vehicularis. We are, instead of being Homo sapiens, we are Homo vehicularis in the sense that we are dependent upon the automobile or vehicles to get around. And that results in pollution. It results in the misallocation of resources. It results in obesity. It results in automobile accidents and noise, all kinds. So you can't just say that the automobile is a tool. It's simple. It's not that simple. It's not that simple. So if Africa has the opportunity to look at tools, to look at technologies and hopefully to step back and say, is this tool appropriate? Is this technology, is this system appropriate for what we need to survive? And if you look at the automobile, for an example, you'll find that it's in many respects a dead end. It's not. It's not a viable technology. I was thinking of. You have to recognize the fact that humans are on this planet with a new life form in a way. Technology in the form of metals and plastics and fuels and computers are competing in a way with human beings for the future of the planet. And I know that sounds kind of crazy to say, but if you read some of Kevin Kelly is a writer whom I have great respect for. Kevin Kelly was one of the founders of the Whole Earth Review movement back in the 60s and 70s, and he has some very interesting insights into how technology has transformed the planet to the point where technology itself is in control. Humans are not in control of technology. In the same way. And if you look at GIS, GIS has been used, it's true, to preserve forests and to restore ecosystems, but it has also been used to explore for oil and to build prisons and to map crime so that police can be used as an occupying force in minority communities and so forth. So, you can never accept technology on its own terms. You have to say to yourself, well, wait a minute. I'm the human being here. I'm the thinking, reasoning, feeling animal, and I can make choices to either use technology or to declare my independence. It's not just a matter of using it for good and evil. It's more like, shall I use it at all? Should I take my car or should I take my bicycle? Rather than, should I get a hybrid vehicle so that I can go to the store without polluting the atmosphere? Well, that's not really the answer. The answer might be, riding your bicycle, or instead of going to the store, across town where they have huge lots of groceries, you can go across the street where they have smaller and perhaps more healthy products and so forth. So, think about technology. That would be my, if I were on my deathbed and somebody say, what insights can you give me? I'd say, well, don't trust technology.
Yeah, Don't trust technology. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee.
And that includes artificial intelligence, I guess.
Yeah, sure, definitely. That definitely includes artificial intelligence. Of course, becoming the most prominent technology now. Revolutionizing pretty much all of the aspects of human life. And thank you so much for that insight, Dr. Lee. Including, not, of course, you're a retired federal scientist. I haven't said this a lot of times here on this episode. And of course, you've spent a lot of time here on Earth, 1944. That's a long while here on Earth, quite a time. What would be one career advice and one life advice you give to our listeners?
Well, I guess I haven't emphasized the setbacks that have occurred in my career. Some of them have been of my own doing. I joined the Coast Guard because I dropped out of college. I went to the U.S. Geological Survey because I was denied tenure at a university. I went to Africa because I had dropped out of MIT. So one of my career advice, pieces of advice would be to profit from failure. When you have experienced a setback, either because of some mistake you made or something that was done to you, or just a random misfortune, try to look at the ways in which that setback can be, even though it feels it makes you unhappy and makes you discouraged at the time, try to recognize the fact that it may be an opportunity to make a change that was necessary. Yeah. So that would be, one item of career advice would be to accept adversity. I mean, I know it sounds trite to say it, because when you're experiencing a setback, when you're fired from a job or you get sick, or someone has rejected you, it's very saddening and very discouraging to have that experience. But if you could at some point say to yourself, well, maybe tomorrow or next week or next month or next year, I'll look back on this and recognize that it was an opportunity to make a change or to move in a new direction that I might not have had. That was the answer. I think that was the answer to one of your questions. I'm not sure what the other question was.
Just one life advice, just one career advice and one life advice.
Well, I think that was, I think that was it. I think that, you have to, I mean, I guess in terms of negative, in terms of my own advice to others, that I just told people something I would do that I think others should do. I guess the one regret I have, I think, is that if you're a bright young man or woman in the United States, you are rewarded for your intelligence, your technical, mathematical, cognitive skills. And I think that you can tend to ignore other dimensions of your personality. And I think to some extent, I think we all know people who are very, very smart intellectually, but they're not particularly very smart when it comes to emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And I think one life lesson I would give to other people, and it's really hard to know how to put this into practice, would be to recognize the fact that we are fundamentally emotional beings, and that we need to relate to ourselves and to other people not only on an intellectual basis, but on an emotional basis. And the best way to do that, I'm fortunate to be married to a woman who has better insights in that area than I do. So I would say that whenever you're engaged in a conflict with someone, you try to understand that person, not logically, but emotionally. So when you're engaged in a conflict with a person, you need to think not how that person is being wrong or being stupid or being foolish. You need to think, why is that person behaving in that way? What is that person feeling that makes them behave that way? How can I understand those feelings better in such a way as to help myself deal with the conflict? I know that's pretty far from data science, but it's certainly a lesson that an old man would like to convey to a young man or woman.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. So finally, Dr. Lee, because of course this is a podcast for African data scientists. Now, based on your time here in Africa, time away from Africa as an internal, as an external, how much promise do you see in Africa as a continent? And now what makes you say that?
Well, I think you need to answer that question at least in two ways, although you can answer it in hundreds of ways. But, when you say the promise of Africa, I think you need to look outward and inward. I think starting with outward, I think, I don't know, it probably wasn't, I know my dissertation, if I go back to my dissertation, there was a chapter in which I quoted some Roman scholar who said something new out of Africa. I think it was Scipio. So there has always been something new out of Africa. And I just watched a movie that took place in Johannesburg, Tsotsi, Tsotsi. And, you watch the South African actors and you watch them and they're fascinating people. They're not like the people I know day to day. I mean, their expressions and their rhythms and their words and their ideas are different from those that I have. So one thing was, what is Africa's hope for the world? Africa needs to say to the rest of the world, we are our own. I mean, Africa is a big continent. It consists of hundreds of 50 nations and hundreds of ethnic groups and thousands of languages. But it has to assert itself constantly, assert its uniqueness and its individuality, and say to the rest of the world, we're not like you. We're not, whether we're Yoruba or Igbo or Hausa or Fulani or, just to look at Nigeria as a whole, we are unique, and we must not let our unique culture become subsumed into the dominant kind of Western homogeneous culture. And then locally, so looking inward, I think Africa needs to recognize the fact that there is so much in Western culture and technology that needs to be rejected or improved upon, but maybe just ignored, just as to say, we don't need that. We don't need all of the. We certainly don't need we don't need to base our culture on the consumer culture that appears to be a dead end for the climate, for the planet. I mean, I've been saying that this pandemic could be viewed as a bottleneck in the sense that, at least in the West, it's a large bottleneck in the sense that it seems to be killing older people with pre-existing conditions, and to some extent minorities. And but it's a lesson that coming next, or coming on the horizon, or at least is a much narrower bottleneck, namely climate change. I mean, I don't think most people don't recognize the extent to which the planet is facing a major environmental crisis. And so I think Africans need to say, individually and collectively and culturally, how are we going to get how are we going to survive? I mean, there's no question that it's going to be a catastrophe for millions and millions of people. I mean, there's no avoiding that. But you have to say to yourself, is the answer? I mean, there are three postures that you can take. One is the answer is more technology, more clever thinking, which I call the shiny option. Then there's the option which is business as usual. We just could keep going on and make America great, make Africa great. That we can just keep doing what we've been doing. And then there is the third option, which is radical thinking, and it involves things like alternative technologies. It involves things like less of everything, less consumption, less pollution, less destruction, less environmental transformation, just less of everything. I mean, I think if I could, wrap up my philosophy, and this is something I haven't been, when I was born, when I was starting out in the 40s and 50s and 60s as a young scientist, I wasn't thinking about those kinds of things. But now, many, many years later, many decades later, I keep thinking less. Small is beautiful. Small planet. It's a very, very small planet in a very, very large universe which has huge amounts of potential. But unless the humans on this planet are able to manage this small speck of Earth for their own survival, we're not going to make it. And the jury's out. I mean, there is absolutely no certainty that human civilization is gonna survive the coming crisis. I know that sounds pessimistic, but it's something that I deeply believe.
Well, such an amazing way to end this. Well, it's been a very interesting conversation and very insightful, in fact, with you. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for sharing your knowledge, your insights, and everything today, pretty much, because I have learned a lot, and I'm sure the listeners as well are going to learn a lot, or are learning a lot from this particular session. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Lee.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you for the opportunity to pontificate for an hour.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
All right. You've made it to the end of the show. Thank you for listening to this episode and learning from Dr. Lee, the caller session. If you enjoyed it, please leave a 5-star rating on whatever platform you're listening on. And of course, share with your interested colleagues, but help them gain the same knowledge you're gaining as well. Till next time, see you later. Bye-bye.